You know, I'm always torn when we do these discussions, and I'll say that this started probably about 5 years ago, and it started at a science fair when daughter Jessica was receiving an award, and the speaker said, you know, one of the problems that scientists have is relating what they do to the people that they hope to serve, and just as importantly, to the people that they hope will fund their research. And that was the point at which I started thinking, well, that's true in many fields, and certainly it is also true in what we do in traffic reporting, but it is equally applicable to what each and every one of you brings to this table literally, and will take back home and try to implement in your agencies and in your communities. Because in reviewing the challenge forms, I note that in many cases you're kind of trying to reform systems from the bottom up and bring people together in a way who haven't necessarily thought of working together in the past. I noted that perhaps in 3 or 4 of the forms, the general public, the ultimate customer, I think somebody had said, was actually included among the stakeholders. But in truth, virtually every one of us is in the business of serving the public. Some of my early summer jobs included doing laundry for people, stocking shelves in the grocery store, delivering milk door to door when milk was still in glass bottles. And several summers I worked out on the New York State Thruway, cleaning up trash in the service area. And when we weren't doing that, we were providing assistance to the New York State Police in terms of accident scene management and so on. In fact, in those days, the technology was such that our idea of an impact attenuator was to fill a dump truck to the sideboards with sand, just so that nothing was going to get past us. And an arrow board consisted of a 4x8 hunk of plywood with a day-glow orange arrow on it and a bolt in the middle so that you can turn it from left to right. But that was certainly an early opportunity to manage traffic and give people a heads up. And in some ways, the arrow board actually is a great example of communications because it doesn't require a lot of thought. It doesn't require a lot of verbal processing. It just gives people a sense of guidance. I can remember when we first put the arrow boards on the highways over here in Maryland as part of the CHART program about 25 years ago, we could see the difference when an arrow board was behind an unmarked state police cruiser that about a quarter mile away, people would start moving out of the lane as opposed to coming right up on the back bumper of somebody who was stopped in the roadway. So there really are many ways to communicate. They include, of course, verbally, but also visually. And in so much, the bottom line of appreciating what we do really comes down to the fact that the people who are our ultimate customers need to understand what we do. I would also point out that just as our scientist lecturer made the point that if you were going to get funding and if you were going to get your grants approved, then you were also going to have to present things in such a way that people could see the benefits. And certainly that's a big part of the way you communicate and the way you communicate your ideas. I'm always torn between talking strictly off the cuff and or going through some of the things that I've labored to try to turn some clever phrases, and it usually works out to be a hybrid. In traffic reporting, at the end of every traffic report, and I'm very much a perfectionist, but I never come anywhere close to that goal. The reports go every 10 minutes and last anywhere from 45 seconds to 2.5 minutes on a really busy day. And then at the end of that, turn off the microphone, hopefully turn off the microphone and say, oh crap, I just forgot that. So you get another take in a few minutes. I can assure you that as I walk down the hall this afternoon, you're going to hear me muttering under my breath, oh crap, I forgot to cover that. So hopefully we'll get to at least some of the points. One technical thing, is there anybody who doesn't know how to use the neuralizer? Come on, guys, you're kidding me. That's the whole idea. The movie Men in Black, which I think is now something like 20 years old or close to it. It was the guys from the government, the super secret agency in the cheap black suits who would investigate the aliens who were living all around us, taking different forms. Anybody work with any aliens or people in different life forms? Probably have a few folks that you suspect. But it was the device which, if people saw something that they shouldn't be able to remember, little laser beam on top, they'd shine it, and if you weren't wearing the special sunglasses, then you forgot everything you'd seen. The point of the discussion about the neuralizer really is that if you're going to communicate with your customer very often, you have to forget. You have to forget everything that you've seen and learned, everything which is part of your technical body of knowledge, because for the most part, your customer will not start with that frame of reference. So you have to think much as you would describe to somebody one-on-one that doesn't understand your acronyms or your jargon, terminology, that, you know, why something happens, how it happens, and so we get to the point of communications in plain, simple language. Communications is about people being understood or being understood and providing persuasive and actionable information. And that means that it's not necessarily what you said or what you wrote or what you meant to say, but rather what people hear, what they understood, and more often than not, what they misunderstand. So managing the misunderstanding sometimes comes down to the bottom line of perception. You have to gauge your customer's frame of reference, and usually it's going to be unrelated to what it is that you know, what it is that you do, whether it be at the drafting table or the law code or in any other conversation that you have in-house with the people with whom you work every day. You have to think ahead. You have to kind of anticipate, if I'm going to talk to somebody, whether it's one-on-one, if it's in a presentation, if it's in a news conference, that you have to think ahead the conversation that you're going to have, and then while you're speaking, you also have to listen to yourself and make sure that you aren't leaving anything out, which is really important. We speak in plain language. I suggest that we consider the plain language and that we practice. We practice a presentation, because when it comes down to a situation that's really important, unless you practiced it, it's simply not going to work easily. I mean, I'm demonstrating that right now. Our first priority, of course, is to banish not only acronyms and jargon, but also radio codes, 10 codes, signal codes, 11 codes if you have them. I think they do out in California. Here in Maryland, you know, you've been introduced to the CHART program. In Virginia, they're called the Safety Patrol. In the District of Columbia, it's called Roadway Operations, or ROPE for short. And because of the different acronyms and the confusion between the jurisdictions, and here in the Washington area, we serve all three. A few years ago, I coined the term highway help trucks, because that seemed to embody what people actually were doing. And when I talk to people on the phone, they will literally say, well, the help truck is on the scene. The arrow board is here. The help truck just got the car out of the roadway, or he's standing by behind the crashed car waiting for a tow truck. So that reducing something to common, plain language, I find, is often the most effective, and explaining things in a way that represents what people actually do. Also, in the age of interoperability, we have the issue that as you deal across agencies and across jurisdictions, you know, if you've got an 800 radio system now, a trunked radio system, and you go from one jurisdiction to another, it's important that people understand what you're trying to say. I've had police officers and fire department chiefs tell me that as they switch from one radio system to another on their commute home, often they have a difficult time being understood if they're trying to call in something that they see. In the state of Virginia, the Virginia State Police several years ago said, you know, we're just going to use plain language. We just call it a crash, a disabled, broken down car, and use words rather than a signal 9, a 1050, whatever the appropriate code might be in adjacent or sometimes even concurrent jurisdictions. Fire and rescue services have done this for a long time. They operate pretty seamlessly, mutual aid, across jurisdictional lines. Probably the biggest trouble they run into is if the hose connections don't match up with the fire hydrants in an adjacent jurisdiction. But usually they speak the same language, they follow the same protocols. Often our communications, especially between agencies and across jurisdictional lines, will be in urgent and stressful situations. So again, it's a matter of developing the relationships ahead of time and practicing them when things are moving slowly, that it becomes kind of second nature, when actually it is a situation where the stakes are high and there's no time to make up for lost opportunity. I suggest, as you came from all across the United States to the Washington area and you see our town, our city, our airports, our road, our signage for the first time, the challenge is when you go back home, try to see your community, which you know even with your eyes closed, as somebody coming to that from the first time would. In terms of signage, in terms of signaling, just in terms of perhaps even the rules of engagement at traffic signals or roundabouts. But to try to see what your customers see without knowing, you know, consider the neuralizer. You know, just wipe out everything that you know and look at it as the newcomer does for the first time. And I think you'll find that in some cases it will improve your ability to communicate to people. We had a resident engineer come up to Northern Virginia one time from Richmond, and I said, you know, I need to talk to you about the signage in Springfield. And he said, signs? I didn't see any signs. I was so busy trying to keep from being run over by a tractor trailer that I didn't have a chance to see the signs. We have a unique situation here where I-95 from Maine to Florida runs around the east side of the Capital Beltway, otherwise known as 495. And as I-95 goes southbound and joins the Beltway on the Maryland side in College Park, or as it comes northbound and joins the Beltway on the Virginia side in Springfield, because the route number is continuous, the ramps and the exits are not marked as exits. There are simply a little bit of guidance showing you, follow this to get to Richmond, follow this to get to Baltimore. The problem over the years was some of the radii were pretty tight, and we used to on a regular basis have tractor trailers roll over on them because people would come up and follow the signs and not realize that, whoops, it doesn't say it's an exit, but it sure acts like one. And as such, that's one of the pet peeves that I have in terms of the way the standards which mark the cities, in some cases the control cities at the distant points, leaves the question open, well, how do I get to some of the intermediate points? Some of the signage that shows to people, if you're headed toward here, here, and here, follow the sign that says Baltimore or Washington or Richmond. If people have a chance to digest that ahead of time, then they know, now I know what I have to do. And that really is what we try to do, is to help people. You know, in traffic reporting, there are several elements that we incorporate. One is, when we have it, specific actionable information that people can use. Secondly, to try to help people understand what is happening or why. That just simply relieves some of the uncertainty, because in our lives, I think uncertainty is probably the most unsettling aspect that we face. And if you can quantify that, then people can begin to deal with it. If they understand it, they can begin to comply. I think somebody on the forum, and I think it may have, well, I won't say where, but it was the issue of, well, the public won't comply with the information even if they have it. Well, maybe we need to rethink whether that information, although it was well-meaning, was actually understandable and was actually actionable. One of my pet peeves are the variable message signs that simply say, new traffic pattern. Well, new traffic pattern really doesn't tell you anything. If you've never been there before, you have no idea what that old traffic pattern was, much less what the new one is going to be. And if you have been there before, then you're saying, okay, what am I supposed to do? A term for that is actionable information. That's what we use in the broadcasting business. Positive guidance, if you will. Tell somebody, right up here off of 295, there's a sign at the exit that says ramp narrows. Good. Now I have some idea of what's around the bend. There were two signs that I saw coming up 295 or the Baltimore-Washington Parkway today. One said road closed 10/19/12, 10/20 or 10/21. Problem is, I've got to decode that in my mind. I'm lucky I know what day it is, much less what the date is. However, there was a smaller sign that said Friday and Saturday closed 10p or 10p to 10a. Now, at that point, you've made it very easy. I know it's not today. I know it's not tomorrow. I know it's not going to be when I'm commuting to work tomorrow morning, but I know it's going to be on the weekend. It's so simple. It's so simple simply to use the plain language which take people directly to the point where they can say, aha. And by the way, if you're going to put a sign over an interstate, keep the message something that can be read and understood at 60 miles an hour. You know, you may call them DMSs, VMSs. Many of my listeners and folks that call us simply call them the misinformation signs. Because the challenge is, number one, often the information is wrong, out of date. Two, if you do 2 parts or 3 parts, then at least, you know, I thought of it today, that I think maybe we should number the pages, whether you're looking at 1 or 2, because people have to reconstruct the message and figure out, what does that mean if I shuffle it from here to here? Is it a haiku, or is it something that I'm supposed to be able to act on? The result is that if the message is convoluted, It doesn't convey the information that people need. It creates delays. So often the sign that tells you there are major delays ahead has just been responsible for the 3 miles of stop and go approaching that sign, and then almost by definition that assures you that the major delays aren't going to be there anyway. So there's some... I was at a meeting, I go way back with the chart program, back in the very, very early days, and sitting around a table with Hal Kassoff and the folks from the State Highway Administration, somebody said, well, you know, we took a lot of federal money for those signs. We have to find ways to use them. Well, if I had my way, frankly, I'd unplug the extension cords and just plug them in under a really important emergency situation, because so many of the gratuitous messages really wind up just slowing the process. And frankly, it's like crying wolf in the crowded theater. If you do it too much, nobody's going to believe you when you do actually see a wolf. So you have to use your resources sparingly, such that they have impact and in a way that they will have the desired result. The highway advisory radios are something which I think are probably falling into disuse very quickly. Folks have many other ways that they're getting information, but it drives me nuts to hear the rambling apology that starts out with, ladies and gentlemen, the State Highway Administration regrets any delays that you may experience, but, and then somewhere, just as you drive out of range of the thing, goes into the explanation as to what you're supposed to know. Get to the point. Get the message out to people. Also, it has to be in a way that people can identify, whether it's around the bend, whether it's, as we said, you know, the next day or next weekend. I remember the Woodrow Wilson Bridge crosses the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. I think it's the only bridge that's actually owned by the Federal Highway Administration. And it took about 20 years to get to rebuild it. And finally, it's there. It's a beautiful improvement on the I-95 north and south. Milepost 1, well, the Maryland shoreline, or the Virginia shoreline actually starts the Maryland state line. But I'm up here in Baltimore. They've got major work coming up on the Wilson Bridge, and it says, major work, WWB, expect delays, avoid the area. Now, the WWB is a television network that my kids were watching at the time. The average person passing through doesn't know what the WWB is. They might know the Virginia state line. They might know milepost 1 or milepost 0 if they're passing milepost 62. When we do traffic reporting at night, most of our customers aren't the commuters every day, but there are travelers who are passing through. There are people driving the big trucks and making the delivery, moving America in the hours of darkness, as it were, so that we try to make sure that we include mileposts and exit numbers. Milepost markers. Virginia was way ahead on this, and it probably started about 10 years ago. They're not very large signs, but they're every 1/10 of a mile. And with reasonable eyesight, from just about any point, you can see the next milepost. And it was amazing how quickly the general public, public safety, fire, rescue, highway maintenance, how quickly everybody picked up on the mileposts. And then there was no question. If you understood that exit 43 was preceded by milepost 41.5 and the end of the interchange was 43.2 or whatever the specifics were, you'd know exactly whether something was before or after or in the middle of. Drives me crazy when I hear traffic reporters or anybody else say at. At is a word that we probably never should use when describing an incident, because most things aren't at. If it's an intersection, they're before, they're after, or they're in. If it's an interchange in most cases, it's, now the question is that the air conditioning or is that the heat? Well, I guess we'll all know in about 10 minutes. In most cases, people need to know. Do I have to get around whatever's happened before I can get to my exit? Can I get to my exit and then pass whatever's going on? If I know how far down the road it is, perhaps I can decide on a self-diversion. But the words before and after are so powerful when it comes to helping people understand. The mileposts give you a frame of reference as to whether I need to divert now, whether I can stop at the next rest stop and figure out what my plan is, or whether by the time I get there, it's simply going to be gone. Both the signs and the websites and the messages that appear on your 511 systems are indecipherable when they're programmed by drop-down lists. Now, I realize that drop-down lists is an attempt to try to standardize a message, but in most cases, it creates a message which is even more difficult than the ones that were on the highway advisory radios. You really have to figure out how to boil something down to just a few words. And when it starts off with a preamble, in the state of Virginia, in the county of Orange, sorry, Candace, I'm just relating something that I remembered from a couple days ago. And then they go on and they tell you that there's something at such and such a point, and it's blocking the left lane, no, the left shoulder, the left lane, the center lane, the right shoulder, and all the real estate in view. What is that, you know, what use is a message like that if you simply turn it off rather than try to decipher it? So often, however, we're at the mercy of the acquisition of information, that it's very difficult to be specific when you don't have the information in the first place. We are blessed at WTOP because over the 2 decades that I've been in the station rather than out flying in the airplane, as cell phones have evolved, we've got more and more people to call us with incidents as they occur. And usually with a little bit of practice, and usually by prompting folks with specific questions, we wind up with incredibly specific information. The next time that person calls, all I have to do is start taking notes, and it's usually right there. Or people will say, well, that's just the way you folks say it on the radio, so I'm just giving it back to you, mostly because that's the way I would like to have the information. So it is not unusual to get phone calls before 911 has started fire and rescue, to get phone calls before the state police have been dispatched, 10 minutes before the cameras turn around and actually find it. Not unusual at all. In fact, it's more often the case. I've literally had state troopers tell me at conferences like these, it's amazing, in your broadcast, I've learned more about the call that I've been sent to than my dispatcher could tell me. I had a U.S. Park Police captain tell me a couple months ago, she said, you know, if you guys have got something in the broadcast, we haven't gotten any calls on it. We send a car to find out because it's usually there, just about where you said it is. It's not unusual for the callers to call and say, just had a 2-car crash. It's just before such and such an exit. It's blocking the right lane. The drivers are out standing around. Does not appear that anybody's injured, but I can see fluid on the ground. So most likely one of them is going to have to be towed. And we'll usually say, any help yet? They'll say, no help yet. It just occurred. And that's the head start of the next highway incident. And it's amazing. Often we'll hear a fire and rescue dispatch that incorporates 2 or 3 interchanges, and they'll get on and they'll go in one direction, and we know that they're not going to find it. And usually I should add at this point perhaps that in our traffic center, we're listening to monitors from Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, probably about 8 counties around the Washington area. I will digress to say that most of the traffic information centers, the traffic operations centers that you walk into will be very quiet. Even the ones that are integrated so that they have the fire, the police, the state police, the highway department, but everybody is sitting at their console, often with a set of headphones, dealing with their sector, with their agency, and the situational awareness is incredibly minimal. Now, in the studio, I've got a 50-mile radius map around Washington. Our reach, WTOP, is beyond that 50 miles. In some cases, it's 70 miles out. We've had come into the center, we've had Maryland Governor O'Malley, we've had Virginia Governors Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, Bob McDonnell. First thing I say is, look at that map, Governor. Your customers, our listeners, your constituents, the people who vote and pay taxes, don't see any of those political boundaries. Doesn't matter. They've got a place where they live, they got a place where they need to get to go to work, or pick up the kids, or make deliveries. So from a regional standpoint, whether you're within one state in several different jurisdictions, or whether you're just isolated, the customer doesn't see the boundaries. The customer really doesn't care whose jurisdiction it is. They just hope that the service is going to be provided in a way that helps them accomplish what they need to do. I think somebody's mission statement included the fact that helping people move in an efficient way to prompt the economy. We might also add to maintain the sanity of the individual. Now, it comes back to our monitoring. So with the monitors going on, we will concentrate in all cases on the state police because by definition that's going to be out on the interstates. Usually we don't try to listen to the county police or the sheriff's department because a large percentage of the calls for service will not be related to traffic, although they will be at times. but you have to kind of sort out what you're listening to and what you don't listen to. We listen to fire and rescue because if it's a big deal or it's even reported to them as a big deal, then of course the fire and rescue is going to be sent. And they're very disciplined in coming back with the return from the scene, which is to say our services are not needed, or we're going to remain for traffic control until the state police arrive, or start another heavy rescue squad, or start hazmat, or check and see if a helicopter is flying, and then you know, based on that, the severity and the likely duration of the incident and the impact that it's going to have on our customers. So often the fire department is the best source of information first. Back when CHART first started down at the State Police Barracks in College Park on the Capitol Beltway in I-95, they set up the Traffic Operations Center long before the one over here in Hanover. And Hal Kassoff said, I want you to come in and see the center. And I walked in, and there was a long counter with one microphone, GE radio console on it, was the SHA base station. And I said, Hal, where are your radios? He said, well, right there. I said, well, wait a minute, that's just the state highway radio. I said, you've got 3 state police barracks operating on the Capitol Beltway, each with their own radio channel. You've got fire and rescue in 2 counties, and you need to know what the other folks know, because in most cases there are more of them, they're closer, they're going to get there first, so it's most efficient if you understand what they're looking for and what they find. So over the years, some of the smaller operation centers have added monitors, scanners, or feeds of the audio off the state police radio. I think that tends to be very, very effective. In Maryland, it's still a separate operation between the state police and the State Highway Administration. Now in Virginia, with the safety patrols, for a long time it's been integrated such that on the state police radio system, the highway trucks, the safety patrol, or as they identify themselves, the radio call is the DOT, that they are able to hear each other, communicate with each other, coordinate with each other, and that we've seen to be a very effective model. The fact that the people who can back you up with the arrow board, or perhaps get somebody slowed down before the blind curve when you're out there and traffic is running at free flow plus, have somebody come out and back you up with some signage, tends to work very well. So that's proven to be particularly successful on the Virginia side. Again, you know, we look in the small scale for the best practices that are used in any given jurisdiction, something that somebody has discovered that somebody else can probably discover with very little expense and rather easily. You know, I spoke of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge between Maryland and Virginia. We also have the American Legion Bridge also crossing the Potomac on the other side of the Beltway. And over the years, there was a protocol that Virginia and Maryland, the state police and the DOTs, would stop at the last interchange on their side of the jurisdictional line. And nobody would cross the bridges. Nobody would span the divide, as it were, except for the general public and except for us. 87 or 86, we had the Veterans Day snowstorm. Everybody was still out collecting leaves on Veterans Day, November. It doesn't snow in the Washington area in November, except last year I think we had a snow shower in October, which kind of got everybody's attention. This was at the very beginning of cell phones, so frankly, we didn't realize that people spent the night on the Capitol Beltway, because on the hilly stretches, the snow had accumulated. We had thunder sows in some cases, so there was 8, 10, 12 inches of snow, and everything come to a stop. The next morning, I was out trying to do some reporting from the car and monitoring, and up in the Virginia State Police helicopter, the barracks commander, Herb Northern, was talking to his troopers, and he said, okay guys, when you get our side cleaned up, head on into Maryland and help them get their side cleaned up. And then with the microphone still keyed, and this is November, he said, it's okay, because if anybody goes to jail over this, it'll be all right, because I'm retiring in January anyway. Well, I've quoted Captain Northern since then, because that was the spirit of do what the heck it takes to get the job done. Later, the legislatures in Annapolis and in Richmond passed legislation essentially indemnifying the highway workers and the troopers so that if they crossed the jurisdictional line for the right reasons and did the right things, nobody would second guess them and find fault and actually sue somebody for being out of the jurisdiction. And I think that that's the spirit. Over the years, as we've had meetings for various conferences, I literally would push the Maryland troopers in the tan uniforms toward the Virginia troopers in the blue and gray uniforms together and say, you guys really need to talk because you own different ends of the same bridge. And over the years, with the exchange of radio frequencies, and we were still operating on low band, it came to pass that people began to coordinate very closely. There were people in both Maryland and Virginia who went out of their way to build those relationships across the jurisdictional lines and to work cooperatively with each other, and essentially to form kind of an informal mutual aid where if somebody had a resource to bring, they would bring it and help the other jurisdiction. Speaking of resources, there was a time some years ago when we had a UPS truck that had run off the Capitol Beltway around on the Bethesda side in Maryland, and it was taking forever to get that truck back out of the tree line. And at that time we were flying in the airplane. We didn't have somebody on the ground to tell us the details of what was going on, and there wasn't a lot of public awareness and enlightenment among the agencies. So out of frustration, I said at one point, I guess it's okay to speed anywhere in Montgomery County, Maryland, except on this stretch of the Beltway, because all the state troopers are down here and we have no idea what they're doing. Later that day, the barracks commander called me up and he said, Bob, I just want you to know that the UPS truck was hung up on a couple pine trees underneath it. Now, since UPS is your computer parts and somebody's birthday gift, we're kind of treating it like U.S. mail. We couldn't just bulldoze the thing, so there was a guy underneath there with a hacksaw trying to saw this doggone pine tree off so the towman could haul the thing back out of the trees. I said, that's great. If we had known that story, it's a terrific story. If you'd shared that with us, then I would have known, and we could have explained it to everybody else, and they would have said, ah, now we understand. Good. That could be my part for the computer. Please handle it with care. Subsequent to that, the district engineer for Maryland Highways up in Gaithersburg, Maryland, Howard Burgess, invited the barracks commander to come up, and he said, let's walk around this yard. Anything that you see here that's painted orange works for me. And if you see anything here that can help you do what you need to do, you give me a call and I'll make sure it gets there. Understanding the resources that everybody else brings to the party is a big part of what should happen, has to happen. We had a conference a couple years ago down in southern Maryland, and the battalion chief said, let me tell you what's going through my mind as I'm responding to the scene of a major crash or a hazardous materials incident. He said, I'm thinking this, and this. Do I have the resources? Do I have the equipment? I'm going through all of this checklist. Now, I've known for years my understanding of law enforcement includes the fact that a trooper, a county officer, sheriff's deputy goes to the scene of an incident long after it's been cleared, if there are going to be criminal charges or if there's even going to be a civil suit, that what he did, what he documented has to stand up under oath in a court of law. So there are different priorities. Now we come to our friend Paul Hubie. Has anybody here ridden with Paul Hubie? He's the large man with the beard who looks a lot like a bear and probably talks a little bit like one. Paul is an interesting person. Up until Maryland Highways decided to go to Verizon telephones instead of Nextel, I was able to call Paul on the Nextel and give him a heads up as to what was going on the highway. By the way, the business card that's over the speedometer is placed there strategically so that you'll be able to just relax while you're out driving the interstates with Paul. When he gets to the scene of an incident, because he has operated construction equipment, because he has operated tow trucks, because he's worked with the troopers long enough, because he understands what the fire and rescue folks are going to do, it's sort of like an orchestra conductor standing up and saying, okay, it's your part, it's your time, I want you to get ready, you're going to be next, and we better do this in a big hurry. There is a sense of urgency, there is a sense of who brings what resources, in what order, whose priorities have to be served. Once the fire department has treated the injured, once the fire department has put out the fire, get the big red trucks out of the way. Make room for the orange trucks to come in and clean it up. But it's a matter of understanding the priorities and the capabilities and making sure ultimately that the public understands the responsibilities. I'd like to talk about a couple specific incidents where that was done well. To digress again, fire in Northwest Washington, Georgetown, very expensive neighborhood, crowded place, hot August afternoon. An old school, the Georgetown Visitation School, is on fire. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The television news crews come down. They go live from the scene, 4 cameras pointing at the fire. Fire Captain Ted Holmes is the public information officer. He comes up to the microphone, and the first question he's asked is, "How did this start, Captain? We understand there were workmen seen running from the building." He says, "Wait a minute. Let me explain our priorities here this afternoon. First of all, we're going to protect the neighborhood surrounding this building. Second of all, we're going to do everything we can to preserve this historic building. Third of all, because it's a hot August afternoon, we're going to make sure that our firemen aren't at risk, and we're going to have to put crews in and out." And then, when all of that's been accomplished, without speculation, our investigators will go in and figure out what started the fire. So it was a matter of establishing the priorities, the capabilities, the order in which things were going to come, and not necessarily going, frankly, with the direction that the news media wanted to go. There was a fatal crash on our metro rail system a couple years ago over in Northwest Washington. There was a press conference several hours after Fire and Rescue was doing a really, really difficult extrication. There were fatalities on the trains. One car rode up on top of another, and it took a long time to get the people who weren't hurt out, the people who were hurt out, and then to recover the remains of those who were seriously injured. Late in the afternoon, again on live television, there was a news conference. The mayor got up and stammered through a briefing that was really awkward. The fire chief got up and stammered through a briefing that was really awkward. I think the head of Metro did. Then Debbie Hersman, who is now the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, her turn to speak. She said, "This is what's going on right now." And in essence, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, "We're still completing a difficult and dangerous rescue. We need to make sure that the hazards have been mitigated. We're going to do this, this, and this. Then we'll begin our investigation. It may last for weeks or months. The report probably won't be forthcoming for at least a year, and we'll have another briefing here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Thank you very much." In other words, it was, this is what we're going to do, this is the way it's going to happen, and this is what you can expect. And it wasn't rude, it was efficient, but it helped people understand. Let's talk for a little bit about press releases and dealing with the press or the news media. Sometimes I hear people say, "Well, how do I know what the news media needs?" The news media needs you, and more importantly, you need them to tell your story. The media is your messenger. They're not the inquisitor. They're not in charge of the situation, but they are the means by which you reach your customer. Think of them as a conduit, if you will. Some people may regard the news media as a culvert or a sewer. I've got that in there as perhaps a laugh line. 1:30 in the afternoon, it's a little tough to tell if everybody's still with us here. But the story, your story, will be more accurately understood if the reporter understands it. Now, most times, general assignment reporters will do a different story every day and really need a brief capsulization of what your agency does, what the area of responsibility is, what resources you bring, everything that we've talked about. But you've got to kind of practice doing that in a very short and simple way, which is the essence of what we're talking about. If they understand the nature of what you're trying to tell, then they will be better able to relate it given the amount of time that they have, whether it's 90 seconds or whether it's a half a minute. Try to tell the story in two ways. One, in terms of things that people can visualize, and the other is in ways that they can empathize. If it's a people story, snow fighters. You know, we've got men and women out behind the plows for 16 hours a day, and they're pushing snow with the storm, moving it back, and somebody wants to know when the roads will be clear. Well, 24 hours after the storm ends, then we may be able to see the bare pavement. But help people understand. After this derecho, a word that we didn't know we needed to know up until July, when this incredible line of thunderstorms came across the entire mid-Atlantic region at 60 miles an hour and knocked down trees and wires and poles, and it was a week before they could get put back up. And unlike a hurricane, utility crews couldn't be moved forward in advance. Everybody had to wait, literally from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Virginia. to figure out how they were going to be needed in their own areas, and besides, they had about 3 hours notice. But folks were getting impatient that power isn't being restored. Well, we understand people are impatient because the ice cream is melting and you're sweltering because the air conditioning is off. But you got people out there in those buckets under the worst of conditions working round the clock with anywhere from 16 to 64,000 volts overhead and trying to get things put back together. And if you tell the story in terms of the fact that nobody could have anticipated this, we've responded, and now we've got 10,000 people, but we've got to restore, we've got to rebuild a major part of our electrical grid, that we've got over, let's say, 500 poles that have to be replaced, and on them there may be another 700 transformers. And we estimate that, that before we get done, we'll make 5,000 individual repairs. And we can't turn the power back on until we make sure that nowhere down the line are we going to set somebody's house on fire. Then somebody may say, okay, I don't like the heat. I'm going to have to eat the ice cream with a straw. But now I understand. Now I understand. When you hear something, when somebody shakes their head, or you hear them say, oh, now I understand, then you've accomplished something important. Weather forecasts. You know, today the models are incredibly accurate. Today Doppler radar can see the approach of a storm, the intensity of the storm. There was a time when you didn't know that. And we would be in deep trouble if the snow did not start in this area before the school buses would start, because some of the school systems would be very bold and say, oh yeah, we can start school, and then about 11 o'clock in the morning decide, whoops, I think we made a mistake. And as a result, then they say, hey parents, kid's going to be dropped off in an hour and a half. Sorry about that, but you're going to have to all run home on the snow. One of the biggest problems we have in the Washington area is it doesn't snow that often, and when people look out the window and see snow, they say, oh my goodness, I got to go. We have pre-treating these days, and as we get a little bit better at pre-treating, we don't necessarily turn the highways into a skid pad. Early on, that was the case. We had some serious issues with putting the brine down in such a way that it actually made things very slippery. But now, and I understand from reading some of the literature from some of the states who, and I think Michigan is one that actually had done a lot of work on this, that when you get the pre-treating right, it's good well in advance of the storm. If people understand that we're not just making a dry road wet for the fun of it, but we're actually anticipating what's going to happen. The forecasts are very accurate, but may be off for about an hour. Here in the Washington area, the rain or snow line may vary by about a county. So people will say, oh my goodness, you said this was going to happen, and it didn't happen until an hour later. Or, oh golly, it happened 30 minutes earlier than you said. People expect, notwithstanding the incredible level of precision that we have, they expect perfection. They expect all stories to be wrapped up in 30 minutes, the time frame you get on a half-hour television show. It doesn't happen quite that way. But if folks can understand that the sequence of events is probably going to unfold pretty much as anticipated, then they can figure out what they have to do in anticipation of that sequence. But the problem that we have is people see snow out the window and they go on the roads before the crews have a chance to start spreading the salt. And unfortunately, we've had experiences where if we wind up covering the roads with cars, it's a whole lot more difficult to make the rounds with the salt spreaders. Usually that does not work out well, and usually it lasts until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. On your press releases, it's particularly helpful if people can visualize what it is that you're going to do on a major project. Skip past the apology stage. Wilson Bridge was a big example of that, because there were several times as we went through phases shifting traffic from the old bridge onto parts of the new bridge. Just help people visualize what the benefits will be at the end and explain that they have a part during this weekend lane shift or whatever the period of time is, that if they will simply make plans to not be there, they will save themselves a lot of time. And then once the project is accomplished, or this phase of the project is accomplished, the benefits will start becoming very apparent, and you can look forward to what the result will be of what some of the signs will say, temporary inconvenience, permanent improvement. Also want to talk about, quoting some other examples, we had a conversation over at George Mason University a couple years ago about incident management. And somebody asked, at that time was Mayor Tony Williams of the district, well, how soon do you come out and have a press conference and give people information. And he said, without hesitation, he said, sooner than you would like to. He said, sooner than you would like to, because you've got to separate fact from fiction. You've got to quell the rumors. He said, you can't wait for perfect knowledge because, frankly, you'll never have that. But you've got to keep things in perspective. But I thought sooner rather than you'd like to was a good way to characterize that. The words that you choose over here on I-95, we had a gasoline tanker come off a ramp, explode, several people were killed. A large part of the road was damaged. And 11 o'clock that night, Bob Flanagan, the Secretary of Transportation, I think Neil Peterson at that time was the State Highway Administrator, but they held a news conference, and very carefully, the words are not that original, but they were well chosen. They said, we are cautiously optimistic that will we have the scene cleared and the road repaired in time for the morning rush hour. Tune in on your clock radio first thing in the morning and we'll give you a status update. So the people understood that folks were working all night, but by the same token, although it was a conservative estimate, that the effort was certainly going to be made, and stay tuned because we will have more information for you. The inauguration of President Obama in 2009 really is a case study in information and expectations. In November, when the district began to realize that as many as 4 million people and as many as 10,000 charter buses, not to mention individual cars, were going to come to Washington in January, a long process of planning began. Along with contacts I had at the DOT, Dr. Gridlock for the Washington Post, Bob Thompson, we informally agreed that we would do our best to get the best possible information to people so that they could begin to plan how they were going to deal with the inauguration. Police Chief Kathy Lanier, I showed her a map that had been in place for the previous inauguration. It showed the roads that were going to be closed and where the security perimeters would be set up. Her first response was, this was going to be much bigger. And so it was important for people to realize that if they got in line to see the parade on Pennsylvania Avenue at 8 o'clock in the morning, they wouldn't be able to stand out on the mall and watch the inauguration. If they were on the mall, they wouldn't be able to cross the secure line that constituted the parade route. That if they wanted to be at one side of the city or the other, that they needed to plan their trips by metro rail or take bus. Now, one of the bold moves that was made was to decide not to let anybody drive a private car into the District of Columbia on that day. That the bridges from Virginia into the district, of which there are 1, 2, 3, 4, probably I think 5 or 6, that they would be closed to all except taxi cabs and for-hire vehicles, limousines. But this was to discourage people from trying to drive and park in a place where they wouldn't find any place to park. Because that information got out very early on, at 4 o'clock in the morning, people were lined up on the Capitol Beltway and I-95 in Virginia trying to get into the metro parking lots that did not open before 5, but they understood. They never intended to drive into the district. They understood. And they lined up, as they were asked to do, to take public transportation. There were people queued up at the end of each one of our metro rail lines in Maryland and Virginia, hundreds of people waiting to get on the rail. But they understood that that was the way to get downtown. By the same token, we'd had a call-in show with the chief of Metro operations as well as Chief Lanier, and explained to people, now, if you're not permitted to go down the escalators and get on the platforms, it's only because we don't want people falling in front of trains. That it is absolutely for your safety. It's not because the police officers or the station managers are being mean, but it is simply a matter of common sense and safety. Again, people understood that. During the course of the day, I think there were only a few locations where people found that if they walked in one direction, they wouldn't be able to cross a security area. But I think, to me, what told the most was, at the end of the day, I believe DC Fire and EMS treated something like 2 to 3 dozen people. And it was either, well, it was basically for dehydration. Why? Because people decided early in the morning that they didn't want to use a porta-john in the middle of January on the mall in the nation's capital. Therefore, they didn't go to Starbucks for the, whoever's got the biggest one here, that they just laid off of that. The thing was, we managed expectations. I mean, this is what the police chief said early on. She said, our biggest challenge is going to be managing expectations. And regardless of the scope of the project or the severity of the incident, if you can do that, then people will come away understanding and probably perhaps a little bit appreciative. we talk here a lot about the retail customer because ultimately the user of our systems, of our roads, of our transportation networks, or any other service that we provide is ultimately the person, the ultimate customer. But by the same token, they are also the taxpayers and they are also the voters. So to the folks who run for office, serve in the legislatures, make the policy decisions, these are the people to whom we are all ultimately accountable and to whom we're responsible and for whom we work. Now, part of the problem is that you will, and just about everybody has some degree of budget constraints, and you have to be able to make the case as to what your agency does or is trying to do or what services you're providing. And that in itself is probably a huge challenge. In fact, the risk is the better you do the service, the less people the less people know. Can we edit the tape? No, the less people are going to realize that they need the service. And until something reaches a level where somebody says, oh my God, this is unacceptable, we've got to do something about this, how much is it going to cost? Until it reaches that point, folks just take what you do largely for granted. It sometimes takes a champion. Now, you can't always do this at the highest level, but here in the state of Maryland, long before the CHART program began, Ed Buck was the father of Dave Buck, who's public information officer for Maryland Highways. Oh, hi, Donna. Oh, that's my cue. We've almost used up our time. Thank you. Ed Buck was given the chance to implement a program which was at that time dubbed Reach the Beach. Across the Chesapeake Bay and 100 and so miles or 150 miles out to Ocean City, Maryland, Rehoboth, Delaware, and all of the resorts along the coast. At that time, Don Schaefer was the governor of Maryland. He'd been the mayor of Baltimore. He was a man who wanted to get things done quickly and efficiently. In fact, there's a story in Baltimore City. He told his public works head, he said, you know, there's a few abandoned cars out there in Dundalk. We need to get them off the street. And the guy said, well, where are the abandoned cars? And Mayor Schaefer said something like, it's your job to find out. It's amazing how many cars were towed off the streets of Baltimore in response to that. But Don Schaefer, Ed said, told him, you do what it takes to get traffic moving along Route 50 and Route 301 out to the short points. And if anybody doesn't like that, have them talk to me. So there you had a champion who's willing to take the responsibility for somebody who goes out and does the right thing. I maintain that for all of the video, for all of the surveillance, for all of the technology which people are trying to sell us, which we may or may not need, that if you have an operations center with a bunch of big screens, but you don't have men and women with courage and imagination, folks who are willing to get out of the truck on the interstate and stop everything and resolve the problem, then all of what you have is essentially a video game, and you are never going to resolve or mitigate the issue. It ultimately takes people. I saw in the challenge forums that it is a matter of training, it is a matter of continuing the knowledge and the expertise, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges, and that's something I think that everybody needs to face. But here collectively, if you find that somebody has discovered one little thing that works, perhaps that's the best way to implement something that doesn't cost a lot of money, but has a tremendous payoff. I want to recommend two books. I've almost finished reading Colin Powell's book, It Worked for Me. Basically, this is a series of experiences that he had in his life, beginning as a lieutenant in the Army and up through and including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State. These are short chapters. These are things that I could identify with having been in the military, but I think every manager and leader can identify with them. It worked for me, and the chapters are short. You could actually read this in the bathroom and finish a chapter without a long line forming outside, so it's very handy. Rudy Giuliani's book, which when I started reading Colin Powell's book, I went back and took this one off my bookshelf. 9/11, the response of the city of New York and Mayor Giuliani's staff in 9/11 was, I think, probably quite extraordinary. But in his book, he said that everything that they had done up until then, to anticipate and deal with the situation, it's entitled Leadership, Rudy Giuliani, prepared them for what they could never have anticipated, and for which they could never have planned. That it was a matter of, when people say, well, are we prepared for the next snowstorm, attack, epidemic, whatever it is, name it? The answer is never. Of course we're prepared for it. But the thing is that we should never let one day go by without being just a little more prepared for it. We can do one thing today that will help us be a little bit closer to dealing with the things that you can't anticipate. The other takeaway was that you find the best people you can, and then you try to put them in the position where they can be the most successful, And when it comes down to it, it really is all about training, and it is even more about training. It is really all about people. We often hear that you need to think outside the box. Well, my bottom line is here that you need to get out of yourself and look at the world around you, to look at the impact that you're having by what you're doing or not doing, and then ultimately step back a couple steps and see ourselves and what we're doing as our customers ultimately view it. And that really is the point of our discussion today. Thank you. Do we have 2 minutes for questions, Donna?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Pointed questions, barbs, observations. You guys are going to have a lot to talk about during the rest of the session here and when you get home and on the listserv, because it's really all about taking the best, not what somebody's trying to sell you, it's about taking the best practices that somebody else has already figured out and incorporating and adapting that into your own way of doing things. And I think in the long run, that resisting the things that people are trying to sell us, helping people buy into the mission that we're trying to accomplish, which is ultimately service, that we can make a difference. And sometimes working hard but knowing that we've made a difference can be just plain a lot of fun. I never walk out a door without thinking, what could I have done differently that I could have done better? No doubt I'll go out and think about a whole lot of things that I wish I'd said or said differently. And I'm sure before I get to the elevator, you'll hear me say, oh crap, I should have said that. But I know that each one of you brings more ideas individually and put together, that the result of that, when you take them back to your departments and agencies and jurisdictions, will make it a better place. And you're a great audience and in service to people. Thank you very much.